in communications, it's always important to understand the culture, your culture, as well as the culture of your audience, even if that audience is one person. Know where they're coming from as best you possibly can, because sometimes you may have a different things. A friend of mine, her name is Jeannie. She was working at a different college. And so I talked to her, and one time she sat there, and we've been friends for years. She says, David, just so you know, I came to the United States when I was 14 years old, and I'm Japanese, and I really don't understand your jokes, and I have no appreciation for some of your corny humor. She said I had corny humor. Okay, and so she gave clarification, and she says, that's why I don't laugh, because I don't really think they're funny. Okay, so just because she has a bad taste in humor doesn't mean anything, but that was her culture, but at least she explained that to me. And that was the first time I really paid attention to this topic of culture, because the way you're raised is the big thing, and your environment around you is huge, as to how you're gonna sit down and interpret things coming into your vision, into your ears, into your different things, because you have a unique set of values, traits, morals, and customs that are shared by everybody in your society. Even here in the United States, okay, we have massively different cultures between the deep South and the Midwest and the East Coast and the West Coast. There's massively different cultures just in one country, let alone across the entire world. It's an operating force that molds the way we think, behave in the process. Now, once upon a time, I got a phone call when I was working out at College of the Desert. One of our adjunct faculty, she was connected a lot to Chinese delegations coming into the United States to see how we did business. She calls me up and says, David, I'm over here at LAX, and I got a whole group of Chinese HR professionals, and they want to come out and visit our office. Huh? I says, and she says, yeah. And so is that okay? I said, well, I guess. I said, how many do you have? He says, oh, we got 10 or 12. She really had 16. They stuffed them all into one van. And then these people, these poor Chinese HR pros, they flew in all the way from China, and they're going through gathering their luggage and everything else. All the stuff, the luggage fit in a second van. They packed them all into one. And so they bring them into her office, and there were 12. There were almost 18 of them, almost as 17. Plus we had one person coming into the room, and we put them all in a room that could handle 14 people. So everybody, they're stuffed on the plane. Now we stuff them into a conference room, and we're talking about how we do business. So they're trying to translate English into Chinese in their own thinking process. They're crammed together, and they just flew on a long flight from China. The chance of us making connection was pretty slim. We had some fun moments though, especially that first year. We had this trip over a series of time. At the end, we had a really wired down pattern. We had a lot of fun each year, us in the United States, as well as our Chinese HR pros. But one of them was, I had one of my female security officers come in. And she was actually one of the better officers that we had on the police force. I was also in charge of the police. So she came in, she gave me a report, she left, and they said, you have a woman for a police officer? Oh my gosh, that's a man's job. I said, wait a minute. I said, no, she's one of the best officers I had. And what's the gender got to do with it? And by the way, you're communist. You're supposed to let everybody be open and equal. That is in your doctrine. And then so we had this dialogue going back and forth. And then later on, they want to know, it says, now, when people get married, okay, how do they get your approval? What kind of forms do you use to give your approval? And I kind of looked at our other staff members. He says, well, they don't get permission from us to get married. They kind of go out and get married. Well, what about having children? This is back when they had the single child policy. The HR offices in China would typically handle a lot of these single child forms. So I said, they can have as many kids as they want. I said, the more the better off. And so we had to connect across this culture, and we really got to enjoy each other, especially as we developed our program better as we went through. And you look at the difference, there's a lot of difference in culture we call high context versus a low context. You'll see the different aspects of it. The high context, they have a lot of relational, a lot of intuitive, and the low context, they're linear and they're logical as they go through. They're very individualistic compared to the high context where they're very group oriented. And you have to keep that in mind. That'll help you understand where they're coming from. The low context cultures, they tend to be logical, linear, they're action oriented. On the high context, it's all about relations between, as they go through the process, they're collectivist, they're contemplative. They leave a lot of things unsaid. Okay, you'll see a lot of that in different cultures you go through. They'll sit down and they'll give you cues by the posture, by the voice inflection. You have to almost rely more on the nonverbal. And if it's a different culture and a different language, nonverbal sometimes is so different than we have over here in the United States. Low context, they prefer self-assertion, personal achievement, and the high context, they prefer group values. You see very different relations in them as to how they're raised in the process they go through. You also have these things about the low context cultures where time is precious. Boom, 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 let's get going. If you go, like, for instance, to South America, being late is how you're supposed to operate on a regular basis. If you start a meeting right on time, you're rude by their standards. If you start a meeting 10 minutes late in the United States, you're rude by our standards. So it depends as to what you're going through. Some countries, it's always wrong to talk business while you're eating food. You talk about business either at dessert or at drinks or after when you're all done. So watch where you're coming from and be cautious in the process of making big assumptions. By the way, people also have a time orientation and the individual basis as well. One of the great writers on this comes from Stanford University, named Zimbardo. Feel free to go look his stuff up on time orientation. He came up with 5 different orientations, and he said that each one of us has typically 2 different ones as you go through. Past, you view it as positive or negative, okay? And your present, he called the present hedonistic for the positive people, and the present negative, and future. So there's some people, they dwell on the past so heavily, it interferes with their communication here in the present, or they struggle with looking what's going to happen 4 or 5 months now because they're not future oriented. So you typically people have 2. My instance is I tend to be present positive and I'm very future oriented. You may have something totally different where my son, he is actually past positive and future. He really doesn't live in the present at the moment. So it's interesting watching people as you go through. This is certainly an area of fascinating study, and I'm only bringing it here because of the topic. Okay, power distance, Hofstede's, you find this in your text. It's about societies, how they're based on how far the less powerful members will accept an unequal distribution of power, and it depends what they do. High power distance countries, okay, the subordinates expect formal hierarchies and embrace the authoritarian paternalistic power relations. That doesn't fit really well a lot in the United States, especially with a flat organization. So the power distance is a big thing, and also is the how we go through looking on the high context cultures and low context cultures. You will also see people, for instance, I work with a bank, and the bank is actually owned by Japanese, run in the United States. You have a mixture of the high context and the low context cultures on large amounts of money. It's always run through the higher levels of the bank, but on the lower end, it's always at the lower end. So it depends what you're doing in the process. You'll see a mixture of styles as you go through. It also has an effect on social media, okay? It can bridge cultural differences as well as reinforce them. And every once in a while, it may give you a feeling of isolation because you don't see that there is a difference between how they're communicating. So on social networking, sometimes it deepens cultural differences. Usually, it really provides an improvement if everybody's calm and kind and treats the other person with dignity and respect in the process as you go through. So much of what we say becomes interpreted by the culture of the audience. It's up to us to adapt, be flexible, and understand who your audience is to make the very best of connections.